Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It's time to take your questions, and we start off with Martin on Patreon, who asks, since you follow Parliament and legislation closely, I'd like to hear your perspectives on Bill C-41. Charities such as Médecins Sans Frontières say that C-41 doesn't go far enough to provide a humanitarian exemption to Canada's counterterrorism laws. Are you able to comment on whether it does or doesn't? How is the bill viewed in Ottawa? Is it a major item or one that relatively few politicians are engaged with? Perfect honesty, I wasn't following this one very closely, but I did go and do some checking after Martin sent me the question. I had heard a little bit that, yes, groups like MSF were saying it doesn't go far enough. I did hear from one of the MPs on the committee about this. I will say also that this is one of the committees that functions pretty smoothly, so that's kind of an indication as to why we haven't heard too much about it, mostly because there's just no drama around it. Rather, it seems to be going, they seem to be doing the kind of professional things that committees should be doing, so that may be why it just hasn't been a lot in the news cycle. But based on what I've read in terms of briefs to the committee and some of the testimony so far, it's not so much that the bill doesn't necessarily go far enough, it's that there are problems in terms of how the government is defining certain things, and the requirements for certain exemptions, which they'd like to be a little more flexible around, things like that. So a lot of it is technical in terms of what the concerns around the bill are, so that some of these groups don't have to go through as many hoops in order to provide aid to people in these countries who are affected by terrorist regimes. And some of it is just some administrative aspects in terms of the government not having adequate definitions around, how they're defining terrorist groups versus entities, because there's a difference, things like that. Ministerial discretion, what limits are placed around it, things like that. So those are all the things that are really being hashed out in the committee. It's the real technical aspects of it. It's not anything around the bill itself in terms of its scope or intent. It's just more, how do we make this regime work best for these groups who are providing this necessary aid in these kinds of countries for whom there is this particular problem, so that they don't run afoul of Canada's counterterrorism laws. So that's what I've heard. That's what I've read. I would encourage you to check the committee records as well, if you are interested. But that's kind of what I've been able to gather so far. Our next question is from Sean Biggs on Twitter, who asks, there's a lot of back and forth as to whether Mr. Poilievre has proper security clearance. Is it possible to determine what clearance he has and what clearance is required to view security documents that Mr. Johnson reviewed? So part of what the confusion is around here is that politicians don't have security clearances the way that civil servants do, in terms of they have reliability, secret, top secret, that kind of thing. It's different for politicians because they don't have to go through a similar process, because there's the Privy Council process. And by that, I mean, when an MP becomes a minister or has a particular special task, they're sworn into the Privy Council as part of this process for ability to see these documents. And that process does the background checks at that point, so we make sure that there's nothing that they can be blackmailed about, so on and so on. So that's kind of when that takes place. Mr. Poilievre, who was a minister of the Crown during the Harper government, did go through that process at the time, And when you're sworn into Privy Council, that is for life, unless you do something very naughty and it is removed from you. And that's happened a handful of times. One of whom was Conrad Black, believe it or not, because he was sworn into the Privy Council as a great honor at one point, and then he had some legal troubles, and that got taken away. So this notion that I see it a lot on Twitter that, oh, he can't possibly still have security clearance because they need to be renewed every 5-10 years. That's not the way it works for when you're a Privy Councillor. And the thing to remember is it's not about being able to see the documents. It's about not saying something once you've seen them. And that is embedded within the oath to the Privy Council. So I have a copy of the oath here. And this is what anyone who's sworn into the Privy Council, which would be cabinet or necessarily cabinet, but also, leaders of the opposition are often sworn into Privy Council as well. And so the oath says, I do solemnly and sincerely swear or declare, if you are making a declaration and not swearing on a religious text, that I shall be a true and faithful servant to His Majesty King Charles III as a member of His Majesty's Privy Council of Canada. I will in all things be treated, debated, and resolved in Privy Council faithfully, honestly, and truly declare my mind and opinion. And now this is the important part. I shall keep secret all matters committed and revealed to me in this capacity, and that shall be secretly treated in council. So that means once you know a secret, you have sworn an oath that you do not divulge that secret. And then generally in all things, I do this as faithful, true servant ought to do for His Majesty. So when we're talking about this kind of security clearance and what they can see, the thing is that they can see it, but they can't talk about it if it is secret. And that's what the issue is here. Polyev is saying that if he sees the documents, then he can't say anything about them, and therefore it's a trap from the government. That's not actually true. He can talk about it. He can say that he agrees with the recommendations from David Johnson that, the government didn't know. He can publicly disagree. He doesn't, the thing is he can't speak about the details around it, but he can speak about generalities. And this is one of these things where Canadian MPs have a particular problem around being informed overseers or ignorant critics. And Canadian MPs, and there is academic research on this, have typically wanted to be ignorant critics because they know the moment they have read those secret documents, they can't be bombastic and flamboyant and give soaring rhetoric about it. They have to be circumspect in what they say, and they don't want to be circumspect in what they say, and that is why they don't read the documents, or that's why we haven't had a parliamentary process for now secretly cleared national security issues right up until the creation of NSICOP. So that's kind of the situation we're in. Polyev could absolutely see the documents at any time he wants. He has that. He has already been sworn into Privy Council. He knows about the Security of Information Act. It's a choice that he doesn't want to see them. And there's been some confusion because when I think it was Katie Telford was at committee saying that the briefing was offered and he declined it, people took that to mean that he could not or refused to get a security clearance. That's not the case. It's that he refused to see the documents. So that's where that confusion lies. Again, this is not the same process for security clearance that a civil servant would have. Because he's in the Privy Council, he is sworn to keep all matters secret that are entrusted to him as such. And for him, it's a choice that he doesn't want to see them because he wants to be able to essentially mislead Canadians about what it is in those documents. He wants to be able to say the government is covering up collusion with China or whatever, because he thinks he can get away with that. Whereas if he actually saw the documents and could see that that was not actually the case, which is what David Johnson is saying, then he couldn't make these kinds of statements anymore. And those not being able to make those statements hurts his ability to say things to get clicks and fundraising dollars and so on. So that is his choice not to do so. It is not an inability or that he doesn't or can't get security clearance. That particular meme needs to die, and I'm hoping that everyone can provide this corrective after having seen this video. Our final question comes from Gavin Bamber, who asks, if/when Poilievre becomes PM, can he call the public inquiry that Trudeau is denying us, or does the issue die at the end of this parliamentary session? He can absolutely call a public inquiry on whatever he wants. That is the prerogative of a prime minister. If we couldn't call public inquiries into things that happened before the current parliamentary session, we couldn't have most of the inquiries that we've had to date, particularly some of the big ones, because that has all been it's generally stuff that's happened in the past and under previous governments, and yeah, that's basically it. It's, yeah, he could absolutely call one on these if he wanted to. This stuff doesn't die during after the parliamentary session in that same way as other issues would. And that's everything for this week. Thank you for all of your questions. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.